The microphone crackled as Chuck Norris leaned forward, his trademark smirk cutting through the arena's electric atmosphere. 40,000 people held their breath in the Houston Astrodome, sensing something was about to shatter the carefully orchestrated peace of this celebrity charity event. Muhammad Ali sat 3 seats away, his hands resting calmly on his knees, but those who knew him could see the subtle tightening around his eyes, a tell that had once warned opponents they were about to walk into something devastating. "You know, Muhammad," Chuck's voice carried across the stage with calculated precision, each word designed to cut. "All that dancing around the ring makes a man wonder if you ever learn to stand still and fight like a real man." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was pregnant with decades of unspoken rivalry, with the weight of 2 legends who had circled each other in the public eye, but never truly collided. Ali's fingers drummed once against his thigh, a rhythm only he could hear, the same pattern he'd tapped before the Thriller in Manila. The crowd sensed blood in the water, their collective intake of breath creating a vacuum that seemed to pull all sound from the massive arena. If you're watching this unfold and feeling that electric tension crackling through your screen, hit that subscribe button right now, because you're about to witness something that changed both these men forever and redefined what we think we know about strength. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, whether you're in your living room in Ohio or on a lunch break in Tokyo, and absolutely smash that hype button, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about courage, respect, and what it really means to be a champion when the cameras are rolling, and your legacy is on the line. The charity gala had been months in the planning, a star-studded affair meant to raise funds for children's hospitals across Texas. But the real story began 3 weeks earlier in a cramped office above a boxing gym in downtown Houston. Ali had been reluctant to attend, his Parkinson's already beginning to slow the legendary quick wit that had once made him untouchable in interviews and press conferences. His wife Lonnie had found him staring at his reflection in their bathroom mirror, watching his hands shake as he tried to knot his tie. A simple task that had once been automatic, now requiring conscious effort and multiple attempts. "I don't want them to see me like this," he had whispered, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had spent his life being larger than life, who had convinced the world he was invincible through sheer force of personality and an unshakable belief in his own mythology. But Lonnie had seen something else in his eyes that morning, not just fear of public exposure, but a deeper hunger to matter one more time, to prove that the essence of what made Muhammad Ali great hadn't been stolen by the disease that was slowly claiming his body. She had placed her hands over his trembling ones and helped him finish the tie, and in that moment, they both understood this appearance would be about more than raising money for sick children. Chuck Norris, meanwhile, had insisted on being seated at the head table, his publicist promising event organizers a memorable appearance that would generate headlines and remind the world that the martial arts legend was still a force to be reckoned with. What Chuck's team hadn't shared was the real reason he wanted to be there. A 15-year-old wound that had never properly healed, a moment of public humiliation that had calcified into something harder and more poisonous with each passing year. It had happened backstage at The Tonight Show in 1982, when both men were guests on the same episode. Chuck had been at the height of his competitive fighting career, his reputation built on a foundation of legitimate victories and an almost mystical aura of invincibility that his publicists had carefully cultivated. He had approached Ali in the green room, hoping for a moment of mutual respect between champions, perhaps even a photo opportunity that would cement his place in the pantheon of combat sports legends. Instead, Ali had looked him up and down with those penetrating eyes and delivered a casual dismissal that had cut deeper than any physical blow Chuck had ever absorbed. "Martial arts," Ali had said with a slight smile, loud enough for the other guests to hear. "That's like shadow boxing, but the shadow wins." The laughter that followed had echoed in Chuck's dreams for 15 years, transforming over time into something sharper, more personal, a splinter of humiliation that had worked its way deeper into his psyche with each retelling. Tonight, with cameras rolling and the world watching, felt like the perfect time to balance those scales, to prove that Chuck Norris commanded the same respect as any heavyweight champion, that his achievements deserved to be mentioned in the same breath as the man who had once made him feel small. The setup had been perfect. a casual conversation about different fighting styles that Chuck had steered toward more personal territory, each comment designed to chip away at Ali's legendary composure. He had started subtly, with offhand remarks about the evolution of combat sports, about how modern fighters were more complete athletes than the specialists of previous generations. But when Ali had simply nodded politely, offering no opening for the confrontation Chuck craved, the martial arts star had decided to abandon subtlety entirely. "You know, Muhammad," Chuck had said, his voice carrying across the stage with calculated precision, "all that dancing around the ring makes a man wonder if you ever learn to stand still and fight like a real man." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, impossible to take back, their implications spreading through the crowd like ripples in a pond. Chuck felt a moment of savage satisfaction as he watched Ali's expression change, the polite mask slipping just enough to reveal something harder underneath. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the chance to see the great Muhammad Ali knocked off balance, forced to respond to an attack he hadn't seen coming. But Ali's response came not in words, but in the slow, deliberate way he rose from his chair. The Parkinsons made every movement a conscious choice, each gesture carrying the weight of intention rather than the fluid spontaneity that had once defined him. The disease had stolen his speed, but it had given him something else, a gravity that made every action seem monumental, every word precious because it required such effort to produce. He walked the 3 steps to Chuck's chair, with the measured pace of a man who had learned to make every motion count, his left hand trembling slightly, but his eyes steady and focused. The arena fell into a cathedral silence, 40,000 people understanding instinctively that they were about to witness something significant, though none of them could have predicted what form that significance would take. Standing beside Chuck's chair, Ali placed one trembling hand on the martial artist's shoulder. The tremor wasn't from fear. Everyone present understood that much. This was the same man who had stared down Sonny Liston, who had refused induction into the army, knowing it would cost him the best years of his career, who had climbed into rings with men who wanted to hurt him, and emerged victorious through sheer force of will and an unshakable belief in his own righteousness. When Ali finally spoke, his voice carried the accumulated wisdom of a man who had faced down governments, weathered public hatred that would have broken lesser spirits, and emerged with his dignity not just intact, but somehow enhanced by the trials he had endured. "Chuck," he said, each word carefully chosen, weighted with the kind of authority that comes only from having been tested in the crucible of genuine adversity. "A real man doesn't need to prove he's real." The simplicity of it hit like a physical force, the kind of perfectly timed counterpunch that Ali had once used to end fights in the blink of an eye. Chuck's smirk faltered, then crumbled entirely as Ali's hand remained on his shoulder. Not in dominance, not in condescension, but in something approaching forgiveness, a gesture that somehow managed to be both gentle and devastating. The crowd began to understand they were witnessing something far more profound than a celebrity spat, something that transcended the usual dynamics of public confrontation and entered the realm of genuine human connection. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about something deeper, more essential to the human experience. But Ali wasn't finished. He had spent too many years learning how to use moments like this, how to transform potential conflict into something more meaningful, to waste this opportunity for a teaching moment that could resonate far beyond the confines of this arena. He moved to the microphone with the same deliberate care, his hands gripping the podium for support, the wood grain visible through his knuckles as he steadied himself against the tremor that threatened to betray his vulnerability. The 40,000 people leaning forward in their seats could hear the slight wheeze in his breathing, could see the way his left hand shook against the polished surface, but they could also sense the enormous reservoir of strength that still resided within this diminished frame. Yet when he looked out at them, his eyes held the same fire that had stared down Sonny Liston in a Miami Beach gymnasium decades earlier, the same unwavering confidence that had carried him through battles both inside and outside the ring. The Parkinsons might have slowed his speech and stolen his grace, but it hadn't touched the essential core of what made Muhammad Ali who he was. "I spent my whole life learning when to fight and when to dance," Ali said, his voice growing stronger with each word, drawing power from the attention of the crowd like a performer who had found his rhythm. When to speak up and when to listen. When to stand tall and when to bow down. His gaze found Chuck in the front row, who sat frozen in his chair like a man watching his own execution. A wise man knows the difference. The pause that followed stretched like a held breath. The entire arena suspended in a moment of perfect tension. Ali's hand found the small piece of paper in his jacket pocket, the speech his handlers had prepared about the importance of children's healthcare and celebrity responsibility, carefully crafted talking points designed to keep him on message and avoid any potential controversy. He pulled it out, looked at it for a moment as if seeing it for the first time, then let it flutter to the floor like a white flag of surrender to spontaneity. "This young man here," Ali continued, gesturing toward Chuck with the same hand that had once delivered the phantom punch that dropped Liston. "He spent years building himself into something hard and strong. That takes discipline. That takes heart." The crowd stirred, uncertain where this was heading, sensing that they were being taken somewhere unexpected. But the strongest thing any of us can do is admit when we're scared. Chuck's face had gone pale, the color draining from his cheeks, as if Ali's words were physically drawing the blood from his body. The cameras caught every micro-expression, every involuntary twitch and blink, broadcasting his discomfort to millions of viewers who would replay this moment for decades to come. "I'm scared every day now," Ali admitted, his voice carrying across the arena without amplification, somehow reaching every corner through sheer force of presence and the acoustic perfection of vulnerability honestly expressed. "Scared of what this disease is taking from me, scared of being forgotten, scared of not mattering anymore." His hand trembled more visibly now, but he didn't hide it, didn't try to minimize or disguise the evidence of his mortality. "But I learned something fighting in rings and fighting outside them. Fear only wins when you pretend it isn't there." The crowd had become a single organism, breathing in unison, hanging on every syllable as if their lives depended on understanding the lesson being taught. Chuck's hands were clenched so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white, his entire body rigid with the effort of maintaining composure, while everything he thought he knew about strength and weakness was being systematically dismantled. "So when someone tries to make me small to make themselves feel big," Ali said, his eyes finding Chuck's again with the precision of a heat-seeking missile, "I remember that we're all fighting the same fight. We're all trying to matter. We're all trying to be remembered for something good." The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This wasn't anticipation, but absorption. 40,000 people processing what they had just heard and trying to understand how it applied to their own lives, their own fears, their own desperate attempts to matter in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to individual struggle. Then, Chuck Norris did something that no one in that arena, including himself, had expected. He stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him, as if the weight of Ali's words had physically altered his center of gravity. He walked to the microphone with none of his usual swagger, each step an act of courage that required him to abandon everything he had built his public persona around. He waited for Ali to step aside, and when the older man moved with that same deliberate care, Chuck found himself standing in the spotlight that had always been his goal, but now felt more like an interrogation lamp, exposing every flaw and pretense he had spent years trying to hide. "Muhammad," Chuck said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every seat in the arena, amplified by the perfect acoustics of genuine emotion, "I apologize. Not just for tonight, but for carrying something ugly in my heart for 15 years. His voice cracked slightly, the sound of a man's carefully constructed armor finally giving way under pressure. "You're right. I was scared. Scared that all my training, all my movies, all my reputation, that none of it made me the kind of man I wanted to be." Ali nodded slowly, the tremor in his hands seeming to still for a moment, as if his body was responding to the honesty in Chuck's voice, recognizing something authentic and worthy of respect. "The kind of man," Chuck continued, his words coming faster now, as if a dam had burst inside him, "who could stand next to Muhammad Ali and feel proud instead of threatened. The kind of man who could be in the presence of greatness and celebrate it instead of trying to diminish it." What happened next would be replayed on sports channels and talk shows for years to come, analyzed by commentators and psychologists, broken down frame by frame by people trying to understand the exact moment when two men transcended their public personas and found something real. Ali extended his hand, not for a handshake but palm up, an invitation that carried the weight of forgiveness and the promise of something better. Chuck looked at it for a long moment, understanding that this gesture represented more than reconciliation. It was an offer of transformation, a chance to become the person he had always wanted to be, but had been too afraid to attempt. He placed his own hand on top, and the two men stood there, hands joined, as 40,000 people rose to their feet in an ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Astrodome. But the real moment happened in the space between their eyes, where two men who had spent their lives being strong finally allowed themselves to be human, where the masks fell away and revealed something more valuable than any championship belt or movie contract: the possibility of genuine connection between two souls who had found their way through the darkness of ego and fear to something approaching wisdom. The charity event raised 3 times its projected goal that night, but the money was almost beside the point. The video of Ali and Chuck's exchange went viral before viral was even a word, copied and shared on early internet forums, and passed from hand to hand on VHS tapes that became worn from repeated viewing. Television producers fought for the rights to tell the story, and motivational speakers would reference it for decades to come. But for those who were there, the money and the fame were footnotes to something more essential: the recognition that even legends struggle with the same fundamental human needs for acceptance, respect, and the assurance that their lives have meaning beyond their public achievements. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected began to develop. Chuck would call Ali's house in Michigan, initially to apologize again, to make sure his words at the charity event had been adequate to express the depth of his regret. But those conversations evolved into something neither man had anticipated: a genuine friendship built on the foundation of shared vulnerability and mutual respect. Chuck began making regular visits to Ali's home, bringing his children to meet the man he'd once seen as a rival, but now recognized as a teacher. They would sit on Ali's back porch, watching the sunset reflect off the lake like molten gold, talking about legacy and what it meant to leave something good behind when the spotlight finally faded and the crowds moved on to newer heroes. Ali's Parkinson's would continue its relentless progression, stealing more of his speech and mobility with each passing month. But in those conversations, his mind remained sharp as a blade, cutting through Chuck's remaining pretenses with the same precision he'd once used to dismantle opponents in the ring. There was something almost magical about watching the disease that was destroying his body somehow refine his ability to see directly into the hearts of others. "You know what I learned fighting Foreman in Zaire?" Ali asked during one of those visits, his words coming slower now but weighted with hard-earned wisdom that seemed to make the effort worthwhile. "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone hit you until they're tired of hitting. Then you show them what real strength looks like." Chuck understood then that the night in Houston hadn't been about him at all. It had been Ali's final demonstration of the rope-a-dope strategy that had defined his career: absorbing the blow, weathering the storm, then responding with something so unexpected and powerful that it changed the entire game. He had allowed Chuck to exhaust himself with anger and resentment, then shown him a better way to be strong. The friendship that developed between them became legendary in its own right, though it was conducted largely away from the public eye. Chuck would arrive at Ali's house with groceries and stories, helping with household tasks that were becoming increasingly difficult for the former champion to manage. He learned to read the subtle signs of Ali's good days and bad days, adjusting his visits accordingly, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence when words were too difficult, other times engaging in animated discussions about everything from boxing technique to philosophy to the proper way to raise children. Ali's wife Lonnie would later say that Chuck's visits became one of the highlights of her husband's week, that he would spend hours preparing for them, gathering stories and observations he wanted to share, as if Chuck's presence gave him a reason to fight against the fog that was slowly claiming his mind. There was something about their unlikely friendship that seemed to energize both men, giving them a sense of purpose that transcended their individual struggles with aging and irrelevance. Years later, when Ali's condition had progressed to the point where words came rarely and with great effort, Chuck would still make the drive to Michigan every few months. He would sit beside his friend's wheelchair, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories about his children or his latest projects, always careful to include Ali in the conversation, even when responses were limited to nods or the occasional smile that conveyed more than paragraphs of conversation. The last time they really spoke with Ali managing full sentences, was on a crisp October afternoon when the maple trees around the lake had turned the color of fire, their reflection in the water creating a double image of beauty that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Chuck had been talking about a new movie role, something about playing a tough guy who learns to be vulnerable, when Ali's hand found his arm with surprising strength. "Chuck," Ali said, the words coming with visible effort but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You already know how to do that." It was then that Chuck understood the full weight of what had happened that night in Houston. Ali hadn't just forgiven him. He'd seen something in him that Chuck himself hadn't recognized. The capacity for growth, the willingness to be wrong, the courage to change. Most importantly, the understanding that true strength comes not from never falling down, but from how you choose to get back up, and sometimes from helping others to their feet. When Muhammad Ali passed away in 2016, Chuck Norris was among the pallbearers, his face streaked with tears he didn't try to hide, his usual stoic demeanor replaced by something raw and honest that spoke to the depth of loss he was experiencing. At the funeral, he spoke briefly about friendship and forgiveness, about the difference between being tough and being strong, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. But the words that stayed with everyone who heard them came at the end, when Chuck abandoned his prepared remarks and spoke directly from his heart about what Ali had taught him in those final years of their friendship. "Muhammad taught me that the greatest victory isn't defeating your opponent," Chuck said, his voice carrying across the packed cathedral with the same authority he had once brought to movie screens and martial arts competitions. "It's defeating the worst parts of yourself. It's learning that real champions don't just win, they lift others up. They use their strength to make the world a little bit better, a little bit kinder, a little bit more forgiving." The crowd that day included presidents and movie stars, athletes and activists, but they all understood they were hearing something true and hard-won, something that transcended the usual platitudes offered at celebrity funerals. This was a man speaking about genuine transformation, about the kind of friendship that changes you at the cellular level and makes you grateful for every moment you were privileged to experience it. In the years since Ali's death, Chuck has continued to tell their story, not as a way to bask in reflected glory, but as a testament to the power of second chances and the possibility of redemption even when it seems too late to change. He speaks at schools and community centers, sharing the lessons he learned from a man who showed him that true strength has nothing to do with how hard you can hit and everything to do with how willing you are to be vulnerable, to admit your mistakes, and to choose love over fear even when it cost you everything you thought you wanted. The Houston Astrodome has been demolished now, but the moment that happened, there continues to resonate, passed down through social media and word of mouth, inspiring countless people to examine their own relationships and consider whether they're carrying grudges that serve no purpose except to make them smaller than they could be. The video still circulates online, viewed millions of times by people searching for examples of what real courage looks like in a world that often rewards the loudest voice and the hardest punch. As you think about the moments in your own life, when pride and fear have kept you from being the person you want to be, when you've chosen to make someone else small instead of making yourself bigger, remember that even legends like Chuck Norris and Muhammad Ali had to learn that real strength comes not from never falling down, but from how you choose to get back up. And sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is help someone else to their feet, knowing that in lifting them up, you lift yourself up too. Because in the end, we're all fighting the same fight, trying to matter, trying to be remembered for something good, trying to leave the world a little bit better than we found it.